Hey there guys, I'm SonicGhost, and today we're here to take a look at the Nintendo Switch 2, Nintendo's latest gaming console slash handheld hybrid. I'm going to be giving my first impressions of the system and reviewing it as a whole. I spent past couple months playing with this ever since it came out in June, and I have a lot to say about the Switch 2 because there's a lot of things I like about it, but there's also some things I'm not the biggest fan of, but that's what this said video is for. And one big thing I'm very happy that the Switch 2 can do now is that this system outputs in 4K. Oh, thank goodness we have caught up to modern technology, Nintendo, because this system being able to output in 4K makes this Nintendo's first offering into the console space at this high resolution. The system itself outputs at 4K and at most at 120 frames per second, but that's mainly if you're playing in 1080p or in 1440p. It's also capable of HDR output as well. So this system is a joy to play on a modern 4K television, especially with HDR turned on. For the games that support HDR and are made with that said color range in mind, things look great on the system. But I should mention, HDR on the Switch 2, at least when it first came out, was a little bit of a hot mess. It's actually something I wasn't a fan of when I first got my Switch 2, and when you first use the system, it defaults to having that said feature turned on if your display supports HDR. And right out of the box, the system did not look that great at all. Things were very overblown. Clouds were blending in with the skybox. Sand definitely just gave me a migraine with how bright it was. So the calibration on the Switch 2 itself was very off when you first set up the system. And going into the options that calibrate HDR, you didn't really have the best options to calibrate. You had all two screens to work with. One just to adjust two different suns you're used to for HDR calibration, where one's barely visible, the other one's not. So that one's pretty good as a calibration tool. And then the other option was just look at picture. Ooh, look at that skybox. What am I supposed to do with this? Well, there was actually a hidden option at the time where you press a button and then you can actually adjust your overall console's peak brightness, which if you didn't set this correctly, things looked overblown. High dynamic range is something that you need to calibrate on both your TV and your console specifically to get the best output. And it wasn't that intuitive to figure out how you got HDR calibrated on the Switch 2. Once you get things calibrated just right, HDR looks great from the system as long as you're using a display that is designed for HDR in mind. So, higher quality TVs like a good OLED TV, for example, HDR shines with the Switch 2, especially when you calibrate it correctly. And just recently, at the time of filming this review video, Nintendo actually updated the HDR calibration process on the Switch 2 now to actually have like proper calibration numbers to it, similar to what you can get on an Xbox Series system by pressing a combination of buttons. So now you can set your peak brightness and know how bright exactly you're setting things by seeing the actual like lumen count, so you know exactly how bright your screen's getting and what you can have things set at as like a preset. Now you can write this number down and save it for later. Now, this is still not as intuitive of an HDR calibration as the PlayStation 5 or especially with the Xbox Series, but once you calibrate HDR correctly, as mentioned before, colors just pop off of the Switch 2 on your TV, and I recommend just leaving the setting for compatibility for HDR. I wouldn't turn that on to having the system always set to HDR. For games that don't support HDR colors, things look a little washed out, a little overblown. So I recommend just leaving the setting if you're going to play with HDR for compatible software only, just to play HDR with games that fully support it. And then you're swapping back to not using HDR for games that don't have HDR. But HDR is not the only new trick up the Switch 2 sleeve. With the Switch 2, we also have 120 frames per second output. So right now, at the time of reviewing the Switch 2 here and filming this said video, not that many games on the Switch 2 support 120 frames per second output, but for the games that do support this high frame rate output mode, they play buttery smooth on the Switch 2. you can only play either at 1080p or 1440p using this 120 FPS output, as the system cannot output at 4K at 120 frames per second. You do have to make sure you have a compatible screen to use if you're going to be playing games with the high frame rate output. And another thing to note is that the Switch 2 via its dock mode does not support variable refresh rate or VRR. The Switch 2's handheld screen does support this said feature, but on the console mode, unfortunately, you cannot output VRR to a compatible gaming monitor, for example. So you will be limited to whatever performance dips a game can have, and that can be pretty noticeable on the Switch 2 in certain titles, but in my experience for the games I played at 120 frames per second, they play buttery smooth on the Switch 2. I haven't noticed any real performance issues with the 120 frames per second output, and this has been a great mode to pair with the Joy-Con 2 using their new mouse mode, as then it basically feels like you're playing a game on the PC with that high frame rate and the more accurate movement that mouse controls can bring. So this is a very, very cool feature that I want to see more games on the Switch 2 use going forward. But you do have to keep in mind, both with HDR and 120 frames per second, not every single game is going to support these said modes, like say with the Switch 1 library of games. As that's one great thing about the Switch 2, as this system is essentially the same thing as Nintendo's previous iteration with the original Switch models or the Switch OLED. So all of the Switch 1 library is fully backwards compatible on the Switch 2. And in some cases, games from the original Switch can just run better outright on the Switch 2, whether it be they have faster loading times, or the frame rate is a lot more consistent and stable for games that had a uncapped frame rate. Games like Bayonetta 3 immediately come to mind, where that game was all over the place on performance on the original Switch, but on the Switch 2, running now at a locked 60 frames per second. You also can have some games that actually have Switch 2 enhancements to it, where they have a little bit of a graphical uplift. So it's the same game that you had from the Switch 1 itself, but now it looks a little bit better on the Switch 2 running at a higher resolution, like say if the game originally ran at 720p, now it could run at 1440p on the Switch 2, and even can support settings like HDR, for example, as well. So it's best to see if your game supports any extra features on the Switch 2 by looking up online if that game you're playing is Switch 2 enhanced. Nintendo does have a website detailing what games are enhanced on the Switch 2 from the Switch 1 library. Not all their titles, it's a handful of titles, but there are other titles that did get a Switch 2 upgrade, essentially just becoming a flat-out Switch 2 game. So you take titles like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, for example, and while you can run those games on the Switch 2 via its backwards compatibility and get a better time from the games with loading and with frame rate, for example, being more consistent, there's a paid upgrade to go to a Switch 2 edition, which makes the games now run at a higher resolution and a higher frame rate, while also offering some new features. And in the case of the Zelda games, now you have a companion app you can use on your phone with Zelda Notes, and that feature is exclusive to the Switch 2 version. You have other games that do something similar, like with Super Mario Party Jamboree getting a Switch 2 edition to add new modes to the game and camera support, or games that might just have like a graphical uplift, say like with Metroid Prime 4 having a higher resolution or even a higher frame rate output, and even offering new control schemes like with mouse control. So there was a lot of different ways you're playing Switch 1 games on the Switch 2, some with some better graphics, some with some better frame rates, some with just better loading times or just more consistent frame rates if it's just a backwards compatible title. So just playing games from the Switch 1 library on the Switch 2 has just been a much better experience in so many cases. I don't really see myself reaching for an original Switch anymore to play a lot of Switch 1 titles, unless it's like something really simple to play. So like small indie titles, for example, they work best still on like a Switch 1, say like your Super Meat Boys or your Hollow Knight, stuff like that. If it's not too demanding, it's still pretty good to pick up old Switch 1, especially with the Switch OLED, and play a game that way. But I find myself reaching more for the Switch 2 for a lot of Switch 1 games specifically, because they just run a lot better, and in some cases might even look better too if they had some kind of upgrade, paid or free, to the Switch 2. But I will say, the Switch 2 versions of games is a little confusing because some games have paid upgrades, some do not. Some upgrades have a lot of features, some are just graphic upgrades, but they both have essentially a paid tier. It's definitely kind of a mess, but one thing I can at least appreciate is that the Switch 2 editions of games that come on cartridges, what's nice is that you can take a Switch 2 cartridge of a game. So in this case, I have a copy of Pokemon Legends ZA on the Nintendo Switch 2. You can tell it's a Switch 2 edition because it's red instead of the black cartridges the Switch 1 had. I can just take this game, pop it into my Switch 1, and then from here, I can just play Pokemon Legends ZA on my Switch 1 or Switch OLED, no problems at all. So that's been one nice thing. Any Switch 2 edition of a game, it does work on the original Switch systems. They are just flat out backwards compatible, physical or digital, it doesn't matter. And some games do have an upgrade path, whether it be a free upgrade or a paid upgrade, so you're better off still getting games usually on the Switch 1 to go for that said upgrade, in some cases for like a digital copy. But just in general, you get a Switch 2 game, you get the Switch 1 version of it as well if that title is available on the Switch 1, and it just works on the system, which has been really, really nice and makes things less confusing for the consumer, especially because Nintendo's target demographic is kids for the system, especially with it being primarily used as a handheld on the go. So no matter if you're playing on a Switch 1 or on a Switch 2, you want to make sure you're getting the right game for that system and don't get a game that won't work on it. So I like how Nintendo's at least handled the backwards compatibility from Switch 2 to Switch 1 stuff, but the Switch 2 editions of games I do think can be better advertised to consumer, and certain upgrades I don't really think are worth putting behind extra paywalls, like with Pokemon Legends ZA, just having a graphic uplift and a performance increase to the Switch 2 edition, but that is a paid upgrade. But you get a game like Splatoon 3 or Super Mario Odyssey, for example, that do essentially the same thing, but they're free upgrades that you just get by just putting the game into your Switch 2. So some of that can be a little bit confusing to the customer, and I do wish that was not really a case on the Switch 2. Now, one thing though you do have to note when you're picking up a Switch 2 system is if you need more storage on the system itself, things have changed between the Switch 1 generation to the Switch 2 generation for how you get upgraded storage. Now, by default, the Switch 2 ships with a 256 gigabyte internal storage solution. So, in a lot of cases, this should be enough for a lot of different players, especially if you get most of your games physically, as you don't have to worry about installing that much data on your system outside of maybe update data or downloadable content stuff. But 256 gigs can still fill up pretty fast, especially if you play a lot of digital-based games, and this generation being now 4K capable means games are going to start getting a lot bigger on the system. And we've been seeing those big system download file requirements for certain third-party games out there. So, for all my friends who've been mainly on the Nintendo side for so many years, as someone who's been playing on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC for over a decade, yeah, welcome to modern gaming. It has bloated files and nobody knows how to compress things. Things get big fast, but you can get an SD card to upgrade your system storage. This is the part you have to be careful on though. The original Switch worked with any standard micro SD card. So you could have grabbed any micro SD, popped in your system, and then you get upgraded storage. Just easy as that. Unfortunately though, those same micro SDs that worked on the original Switch will not work on the Switch 2. Instead, you need a new micro SD card standard called micro SD Express. This specific SD card with SD Express is more in line with the overall storage speeds that the Switch 2 is using with its internal solid-state technology. It's not going to be as fast as the internal drive, but it's going to be close enough. And this is why the system needs that microSD express card in order to play games from it, whether it be Switch 1 or Switch 2. And this is the downside, because microSD express is still a relatively new standard that's still being adopted by SD card manufacturers. So currently, there's not that many SD express card offerings out there, and the ones that are available are pretty expensive. So getting a good SD card size for your Switch 2, I feel is a little bit harder than the Switch 1, and you can use standard microSD cards on the Switch 2, but it's just for your album data, and that's just to move your album data from an original Switch to a Switch 2. You can't put Switch 1 games on a microSD card and play it on the Switch 2 system, which I don't understand this decision, because the Switch 1 itself does not need fast storage to play its games, and Switch 2 is not fully utilizing the fast storage on the internal drive or even on the microSD express card for digital titles. You can get away with the slower speeds, as when you're playing a Switch 1 game physically in a Switch 2, you're going to notice those loading times are slower compared to digital because of just the read-write speeds of the physical game cartridges on the Switch 1 itself are limited, but the system still works with those said cards to play physical games. So the fact that you can play older Switch 1 games physically and still deal with those limitations of loading speeds tells me that the Switch 2 could have done the same thing with the microSD card standard for Switch 1 games, but Nintendo didn't want to go through the extra confusion for the consumer having two different SD card standards on the system, one for Switch 1 games and one for Switch 2 games. So they opted to only support microSD express for storing games. And that is unfortunate with how expensive this new standard is right now, but I mean, games load really fast off of the card, so as long as you can find one for your system and get a relatively good sized card, then this is going to be a non-issue down the road. But as an early adopter in the first year or so of the Switch 2, finding a good quality microSD express card, especially at a good size, has been really difficult. In my experience, I mainly just found 256GB cards, which is the same as the internal storage on the Switch 2. So it's not much better than what you're already starting with. 512GB cards are starting to become a little more common, but they are pretty pricey at the moment. So you still might just be better off, unfortunately, either going fully physical on the Switch 2 for games that are fully on the cartridge, or you want to download games as you play them and then uninstall them and reinstall things and just do a little bit of a data shuffle, which is not the most ideal thing for a handheld system. And now that we mentioned that, I have to bring up the controversial topic that is the game card system on the Switch 2 itself. Because starting with this generation, we have a brand new physical game format for the Switch 2 in the form of game keycards. And this has been, for lack of better terms, not liked by most people. So, to explain how this technology works, the game keycard is essentially the same idea as buying a physical game on the Nintendo Switch 2. You're buying a game that's on a cartridge, you put the cartridge in the system, and that is how you play your said game. But unlike a physical game cartridge, the game keycard does not have the game on it whatsoever. The game itself is just a digital license on this physical media. And because of that, when you put the game keycard into your Switch 2, it will prompt you to download the game off of the Nintendo eShop immediately. There's not a single bit of data on the cartridge, not even update data or anything like that. Everything is coming from the eShop. So game keycards are essentially the same as just buying the game digitally on the eShop store itself. And this is why a lot of people are not a fan of these said game keycards, because they don't really see a point to these existing. there's no game on the cartridge, so why do I get the cartridge? At that point, I might as well just get the game on the eShop. I'm downloading everything anyways, so I'll just save myself the time and the physical space, because maybe I'm running out of space on my bookshelf, so what's a game keycard gonna do for me besides take up more space and cause more inconvenience, because now I gotta keep on taking that card in and out of the system to play another physical game. It just doesn't really have any positives, it just has a bunch of negatives to it. The only positive I can see getting a game keycard over the game on the Nintendo eShop is that you might find a better deal for the game keycard at a retail store because they're trying to clear stock, or the game can go on sale in that physical format, and it might be cheaper than getting it digitally off the eShop, but you're still downloading the whole game, and the storage issues as mentioned with the Switch 2, where it only has 256 gigs in total, and finding microSD cards right now at any decent size has not been the easiest task, especially within that first year of owning the system. This makes it a lot harder for people to really see the value in the game keycard, especially with how big game sizes are, and most third-party companies have been going down the game keycard route, which has been filling up people's internal storage on the Switch 2 very fast, even buying physical. I'm not a fan of the game keycards myself. I haven't bought a single one at the time of filming this said review, because if I have an option between the game keycard and just getting it digitally, I'll end up just getting the game digitally just to cut through all of the hassle of swapping out the cartridge if it's just the same as downloading. So I don't find a personal reason for those to exist either, and I do want to see more games fully shipped on physical cartridges, whether it be from third-party companies or even Nintendo themselves, because the game keycards, to me, not really a great solution for trying to offer physical releases for games that might not get them normally, because it's not really much of a physical release. And it has been a very hot button topic for a lot of fans of Nintendo stuff this past few months alone of the system being out, and it's for good reason, especially with how fast the Switch 2 can fill up with a bunch of digital games. I will say though, when you are downloading whether it be games or update files on the Switch 2, this has been a way better experience than using any other Switch system. No matter if you're using original, the Lite, the OLED, it didn't matter which iteration of the original Switch you used. These things took forever to download games, and you couldn't really do anything while a game was downloading, because if you tried to play another game while something was downloading on the Switch, it either would download extremely slow or just would not download at all in most cases. It would just pause the download until you quit a game, and then you just go on the home screen and just watch this super slow progress bar just like fill up at a snail's pace. Especially for big games, this was the equivalent of watching paint dry. It was a terrible experience, but I can happily say that is no longer the case with the Switch 2, because downloading games on the Switch 2 has been so much faster. This was one of my biggest requests for getting new hardware from Nintendo. I wanted to see them swap out the old network card from the original Switch systems, because the original Switch only had 100 megabit per second network card in it, and that specific network card had to share some of its bandwidth with the Bluetooth functionality for its controllers, meaning that at the most you would get maybe about 50 megabit download from your Switch. That's not much. I have close to 1 gigabit per second on downloads. I have about 900 plus megabit download here, and downloading anything on a Switch 1 would take multiple minutes up to multiple hours in some cases, depending on how big the game was. But on the Switch 2, I noticed that this is much better. I believe that they're using a gigabit network card on the system while still sharing bandwidth with the Bluetooth. In my experience, I've gotten 300 to maybe closer to 500 megabit per second download speeds on the Switch 2, whether it be wired or wireless. So in my experience on the Switch 2, downloading games has been way faster, and it's been able to actually download games while playing other things in the background. So now I can actually play a game on my Switch 2, and it can download games or update files without having to pause them because I'm playing a game. It doesn't have to worry about sharing those resources anymore. So actually downloading things on the Switch 2 doesn't really feel like watching paint dry anymore. And I'm glad to say that, because that's the big thing I hated about Switch 1, and I would end up downloading games like at least like a day before I want to play them, with how slow the original Switch was. Thankfully, that's no longer the case on the Switch 2. Once you get yourself your games downloaded, you will probably want to end up using some of the online functionality of the Switch 2, and just like the other console manufacturers, Nintendo does require you to get a paid subscription model to access the online functionality of the Switch, whether it be Switch 1 or Switch 2, via Nintendo Switch Online. And there's two different tiers to the Switch Online. There's a basic tier, and then the expansion pass, which has more stuff in it, like with some downloadable content for games and other retro game systems like Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, and new to the Switch 2, Nintendo GameCube games. And I will say, when the expansion pass first came out, it wasn't really as worth it as a service, because a lot of the games that were on the expansion pass weren't fully worth the extra asking price, and there really wasn't any DLC on there that was fully worth it outside of the Mario Kart 8 Booster Course Pass. But nowadays there's a lot more stuff on the expansion pass, and with the inclusion of the GameCube games that are for the Switch 2, it does feel like a very worthwhile subscription, and it is the cheapest of the three different subscription models for the three different systems out there from Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. You get a lot for it. You get online gaming, you get your cloud saves, you get a wide variety of different retro games, and even more if you're on the expansion pass, as mentioned earlier. So I do feel like the subscription is worth it, but you can do more than just, play games online with the Switch 2 or retro games with this said online subscription, because you also have access to a chat tool just built into the Switch 2. So now the system, after over a decade at this point, has some form of party chat. And the last time we saw this was with the Wii U and the 3DS back in 2011, 2012. So it's been quite some time since we had some kind of chat functionality on the Nintendo console, as it was dropped for the original Switch. Game chat is actually a pretty useful service on the Switch 2. And this is how the game chat works on the Nintendo Switch 2, and we even got ourselves a transcript up. And I will say the transcript feature on the Switch 2 is actually really useful, especially if you're someone who has a harder time of hearing things, or there's a lot of commotion going on, because this is a handheld but also a home console machine, and there'd be plenty of things going on. So this transcript is a great way to keep track of what everyone's saying, but it might not get everything 100% accurate.
We're gonna have a hell of a time trying to figure out how to make this actually not flag the channel for demonetization. Or demonization is what damn transcript puts it as.
Are you gonna change it up apparently?
No, I'm gonna chow it up. Oh, that's worse!
There's also a text-to-speech function, which also is very good if you can't really talk at the moment, but you still want to send messages through your said game chat.
What's this? Text-to-speech the GOAT.
Once again, just like with the transcript, it's not 100% accurate, but it's still very, very useful and something that's greatly appreciated for accessibility purposes. Right now you're hearing me talk on the built-in microphone on the Nintendo Switch 2, and I'm using the Nintendo Switch 2 camera, which this has a very wide field of view, but in the console itself, you are able to change settings on the fly, and you're able to zoom in the camera, as you're seeing on my side here. You can zoom in and out by quite a large margin, but I don't know if I would zoom in that much on most of these cameras, especially when these are just webcams at the end of the day. You have other filters you can turn on and off to make your camera look a little bit more focused on a very specific subject, which is also a nice thing to have in a very crowded space. But thankfully, you don't have to just use the built-in Switch 2 camera. You can also use another camera in this said case.
So for example, you can just have something lying around that you might not know could work on your Switch 2 or not to be used for game chat. Try out a lot of different kind of webcams you have. I notice a lot of Logitech webcams work on the Switch 2, and pretty much any USB mic, in my experience, has worked with the Switch 2 as well. Like now I'm just using a completely different microphone yet again with the Samsung Q2U, and this microphone has had no problems on the system as well. And in my experience, the webcams that are out there from a lot of different companies, they usually provide better image quality compared to the one Nintendo ships. So you might just have something lying around that you can use on your system, and it's honestly very impressive just to see how many devices work on the Switch 2. And it's very easy to check, as the system does have a test feature for both your microphone and your camera to see what works on the system. And if you're not sure if something would work or not, there are different web pages online that you can go and see if people have put things out there, like Reddit pages, for example, of things that work on the system and what things don't currently. A lot of webcam manufacturers are working on getting firmware updates for their cameras, but as of right now, a wide variety of cameras work outside of just the Switch 2 camera Nintendo sells on their own. And just to really prove a point here on just the wide variety of different hardware that can work on the Switch 2, I'm now recording this final clip using my main microphone, the Rode NT1, hooked up to a Focusrite Scarlett Solo 3rd Gen. Don't believe me on that one? Well, this is not a fake shot, technically. Audio interfaces can also work on the Switch 2. You just never know what device is going to work on the system until you try it out for yourself. I've seen people get full-body DSLR cameras via a capture card hooked up onto the Switch 2, so you don't need to use the included camera and the included microphone setup Nintendo wants you to have for the said Switch 2. You can use any other device on the system. Again, check master lists out there, play around with the equipment you have, but you can be that person flexing while playing Mario Kart and have a full-body camera setup with a multi-$100 audio setup if you really want it on the system. It is just that easy to do, and game chat is very versatile on the Switch 2 itself. A lot of games will just support you just being able to talk via game chat and just share your gameplay feed, although I will say sharing your feeds on game chat itself via its screen share, it gets the job done, but the image is small. You can't really move around your webcam placement on the screen share itself, so you will be blocking some of the screen if you're using your camera in the feed. But most importantly, the frame rate is not the best on the game share itself, so it gets the job by. It's more than what I can say with the other consoles on the market, as a lot of other systems don't do game streaming in party chats. But if you're going to want to see someone play a game, you might want to ask them still to stream that feed via like a Twitch stream, YouTube stream, or even like a Discord call if they have external hardware to do so, like with a capture card. But at the same time, you can still use the game chat for other things as well when playing games, because you can use game chat in very specific titles and have a more immersive experience, like with games like Mario Kart, where your cameras follow your drivers and you can have funny little expressions while you're driving the car and just pass someone by and just see them smiling. Or in Mario Party Jamboree, you can play with your camera and the entire time it will follow your player character, and so anytime anything happens, you can have a very reaction-based moment. Everyone can just be laughing or crying and whatnot, and all that can be captured on film, and it's just a fun time for playing certain games. So while a nice little novelty idea at first, I do say the game chat feature is very well integrated into the Switch 2, and it's a feature I didn't expect to appreciate as much as I did until I tried it out for the first time. Now, for the first year of the Switch 2's lifespan, up until March of 2026, game chat is a free service for everyone to use, but then after that, it's going to require a Nintendo Switch Online membership. But something like this is very integral to the online component of Switch in general, so I'm not too surprised that's getting put behind the subscription, but this is something to keep in mind in the future, as most people watching this video after it goes out years down the road will be needing a subscription to use this said service. But most people might just want to still stick to like calling people up on like Discord on their phone still, as a lot of people still prefer a very tight-knit community, and both PlayStation and Xbox at this point have integrations with Discord. Nintendo still does not. So if you want to talk on your system, Game Chat does the job. And honestly, it's a much better service than I was anticipating when it was first announced alongside of the Switch 2.
Another cool feature of the Switch 2 that's worth mentioning is something called Game Share. Game Share, as the name implies, allows you to share your game with someone else, whether it be in the same room as you or even online using Nintendo's Game Chat functionality. So, you can use the Game Share functionality for games that support this feature to play a local co-op style game on more than one Switch system. And this works on both the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 specifically. But Game Share needs to be initiated from a Switch 2 system, and in my experience, using Game Share on a Switch 1 system, it works fine enough, as this is just streaming the video feed from a Switch 2 to a Switch 1 specifically. So it does work relatively well. It won't look that great on a Switch 1 screen with video compression, but it gets the job done, and the fact that you can play local only style multiplayer games with this Game Share feature without having to buy an extra copy of this specific Switch 2 game in general, it reminds me a lot of the Nintendo DS download play feature back in the day, where you're able to share your copy of a game with someone else and be able to have some multiplayer fun without having to buy multiple copies of the same game. And this is a really cool feature that I honestly wasn't really sure how it was going to work at first, knowing it was streaming video feed specifically, but the Game Share feels relatively snappy. It can have its connection hiccups here and there, especially if you're playing via online with the Game Share functionality, but this is still a very novel way of playing Switch 2 multiplayer games in a local co-op setting, but on multiple Switch systems. Well, let's go ahead and talk about some of the different ways that you can use your Switch 2. And let's start off with the big one, as I've already talked about how the system is capable of 4K gaming or 120 FPS output and such like that, and all that said functionality you get in the system when you drop your Switch 2 into the said dock that it comes with. And I will say, the dock for the Switch family of systems, it does feel kind of like the extension to the Switch itself, allowing it to have more power. When you dock your Switch into a said Switch dock, whether it be a Switch 1 or Switch 2, you're providing the system with more power, which will then allow it to not only output to a television, but also to run at a higher clock speed for its CPU and its graphics card, so it can play games at higher resolutions and higher frame rates in the case for the Switch 2 here. So when you dock your system into a said given dock, your Switch 2 feels like it takes on a whole new life now playing on a 4K TV, and it's a very pleasant experience. And the dock does now have a fan built into it, which is supposed to keep the dock itself cool when playing your Switch 2 for long periods of time. It doesn't cool the Switch 2 itself, but it does cool down the components built into the dock itself so they don't overheat, which is something different compared to the original Switch docks, as those docks never had a fan. But I will say, the system itself, whether it be the actual Switch 2 or even just the fan inside the dock, from my experience, isn't really loud, and I've never noticed fan noise from my system unless I get up close to my Switch 2 while playing a demanding game. But when you're done playing your Switch 2 on a TV and you want to undock it and take the system with you out and about somewhere, or just take the system out of the dock and chill on a couch, for example, all you gotta do is just walk over to your system and just pull it right out of the dock, and now your game will just resume on the Switch 2 screen, and then you could just start playing the game from there with the Joy-Cons attached to your system. It's a very seamless experience, just like with the Switch 1. As soon as you undock the system, it's ready to go and playing the games with no real issues and just converts over to handheld mode instantly. And I will say, the handheld experience on the Switch 2 has been a pretty fun experience, and in a lot of ways, a nice improvement compared to the last generation of the Switch systems, but also in some ways a little bit of a downgrade. And I will explain what that means as we do a little bit of a rundown on the internals of the Switch 2's screen. So, the original Switch was able to output at 720p at 60 frames per second via its built-in display. On the Switch 2, this time around, we have a 1080p screen, which can now go upwards of 120 frames per second for games that support it, and we have one feature that's not included when the system is docked, and that is VRR support, so variable refresh rate. So for those of you unaware what that means, VRR support allows games to, instead of when they drop frame rate, so in normal cases, games that will drop from 60 frames per second down to 30 frames per second due to performance issues, they do this because of things like screen tearing, which is a little bit of a distracting experience, so the game has to drop down to a lower frame rate the screen can support, and that's where you feel the frame rate drops happening. But with variable refresh rate, if a game is losing frames, it can drop from 60 frames down to an oddball number like 55 or 49, such like that, and then pick back up to 60 frames per second. So for super demanding games, it's really helpful to have VRR support to play games that would normally be a very choppy experience, and you would also feel that input lag because of the drop down to 30 and then back up to 60 frames per second. It's not as noticeable when you're playing on the Switch 2 in handheld mode because of the VRR experience. Now, not all games are supporting VRR from my experience on the Switch 2, and it's mainly Switch 2 games specifically, as any game running on the Switch 2 via backwards compatibility, those Switch 1 games won't have that VRR support, obviously. But also I should mention that even though it's a 1080p display, unless a game has some Switch 2 optimizations to it, a Switch 1 game will always run at 720p on the 1080p display, which may not look as sharp as it would on an original Switch system, whether it be the LCD models or even an OLED system, just because of that resolution difference. Yes, you do have a bigger screen on the Switch 2, now that it's 7 inches or so, but that's still, even at that small size, you might notice a difference between the 720p game or a 1080p game on the handheld screen. So that's one downgrade, I would say, going to the Switch 2. But also, one thing is more of a subjective downgrade to some people. It would be just the screen type they chose for the system, because this is an LCD screen, so if you come off of the Switch OLED, going from an OLED panel back down to an LCD panel, you do notice a difference. Colors aren't as vibrant, and you don't just see true blacks anymore where it's a black screen, the screen doesn't have to illuminate on OLED display. So now a black could just appear more like this gray tone on the LCD screens, and you do notice that if you're jumping between an OLED to an LCD model like I did, but it's still a pretty good screen. I will say though, I'm not a fan of the ghosting artifacts that are on the screen. So for those unaware of what that means specifically, ghosting is more or less just how the refresh rate of the screen can keep up with what's going on any said given game, in this case, that's being displayed on that panel. And it can leave a little bit of artifacts behind going from frame to frame, and that is where you get this ghosting effect, seeing this duplicating image over time. And I will say the duplicating image is a little more aggressive on the Switch 2 screen compared to any of the Switch screens I have used between an LCD model and an OLED screen. And that's even also comparing it to other gaming handhelds out there, like the Steam Deck. Now, in most cases, you're not going to really notice this, as this is mainly something you might notice in slower paced, like low frame rate games, 30 frame rate or lower in my experience. that's when the ghosting effect might come even more noticeable in some players' eyes, and some people are more prone to noticing this ghosting effect than others. I wasn't really noticing the ghosting on the screen when I was playing with the system, but I definitely noticed it when I was getting side-by-side shots of different handheld footage for Switch 1 and Switch 2, and that is something I'm a little disappointed with the screen, especially with this having so many different features to it with HDR and VRR support, all that, but with a panel that looks a little bad on the ghosting effect is a little disappointing. So I would hope for maybe a refresh model of the Switch 2 that can maybe use a different LCD panel that could be a little bit better while still having these same specs. And I mentioned it before, but that's another thing I'm a little disappointed with the Switch 2 screen specifically, HDR. The screen does support HDR output on the Switch 2, but barely. Honestly, I couldn't tell you if I was put in a room and doing a blind taste test, trying to see the difference between having HDR on or off with the Switch 2 in its handheld mode. If you told me which is which, I would just have to shake my head and nod because I wouldn't be able to see the difference myself. HDR on the Switch 2, it's good, especially when you calibrate it right on the TV, but when you're playing in handheld mode, the differences are pretty subtle. I noticed that some colors pop a little bit more using HDR on the Switch 2 in handheld mode, but for the most part, the screen itself isn't bright enough for HDR content, as from what I understand, the screen on the Switch 2 can only go up to 450 nits for HDR, which is not considered enough brightness to get the full HDR effect. And because of this, you can notice in some games that when you're playing with HDR on or off in handheld mode, there's barely any difference at all when you keep the toggle back and forth between the modes. So I personally just leave the HDR functionality, I turn that off for my Switch 2 just to get a little bit more battery life out of the system, because again, another downgrade going from the Switch OLED in my case to the Switch 2 has been battery life. It's still pretty good on the system in my experience, getting about 2 to 6 hours of battery depending on the game, but on the Switch OLED it was like 3 to 8 hours depending on the game. I've actually played my Switch OLED when I've lost power due to just power outages in my area, or maybe a storm knocked something out, and I would just play the system for an entire day and never have to reach for a charger once or a battery bank or anything like that. This has gotten me through a lot of power outages, and that's the one thing I loved about the Switch OLED was its battery life. But I found myself reaching for a charger more often than not using the Switch 2, because it's very comparable actually to the battery life of the launch model LCD original Switch from 2017, as these had very similar battery life numbers, about 2 to 6 hours, and it gets the job done. I can't really complain too much because I am playing some big profile games with a lot of power on the Switch 2, and I'm getting some reasonable battery for what the system has internally speaking. And it's on par with a lot of other handhelds on the market, like with your Steam Decks or your ROG Allies or Lenovo Legion Go's, such like that. So battery life to me is good. It's not amazing, but it is good. But I do also want to mention real quick about the audio quality from the Switch 2, as Nintendo has really advertised with this system. They did change out the speaker system on the Switch 2 compared to other model Switches, and in my experience, the Switch 2 speakers do sound a little bit more full and have more of a punch to them compared to other Switch models.
People have been falling ill after coming into contact with the gloom drifting through these caverns. Though here it seems almost misty and not concentrated enough to harm us.
Now, if you compare the audio from the Switch 2 to other devices out there, like maybe other gaming handhelds like a Steam Deck, then yeah, the speakers won't sound as good on the Switch 2 compared to those said devices, but in my experience, the Switch 2 speakers, they do sound good enough for what they need to do. They got a good amount of punch to them. It's very easy to understand when people are talking through games on the Switch 2 itself in handheld mode. And if you ever want to just use headphones with your Switch 2, you can always plug in a wired pair of headphones to the top of the system with a 3.5mm jack on the top, or you can pair a pair of Bluetooth headphones to the Switch 2 and use Bluetooth headphones with the system as well. But one nice thing about the Switch 2 though is that you do have two USB ports on the system this time around, one on the bottom and then one on the top. Normally, on the original Switch models, all you can do is just drop the system down the dock, which would charge it, or you would have to plug in something to the system on the bottom, which means then you can't use the kickstand anymore while you're charging the system at the same time. But what's nice about the Switch 2 having two different ports is that you can plug in a cable at the bottom and charge normally or drop the system into a dock, but you're not just limited to using the bottom USB port for charging, you can also use the top USB port for charging, which then allows you to use the system with its kickstand, and then you can still charge the system at the same time. So this has been a big plus for a lot of people, especially if you use the tabletop mode a lot with your Switch 2. And I will say, the kickstand on the Switch 2 feels really solid, and honestly, it's probably the best kickstand from the three different models of Switch systems between the original Switch design, the Switch OLED, and now to the Switch 2. It feels very robust while still giving a lot of different angles of adjustment, and it's just really good to pop down on a table and then just easy to pop off these said Joy-Cons, since all you gotta do is just push a button on the back and then they just pop off very easily and you're ready to use the system at any given time because of the magnets built into the Joy-Cons and the system itself. It's a very seamless experience, and then when you want to just take the system, whether it be out of your dock or close up the kickstand in the back so you can just play it again in portable mode, you just slap the Joy-Con back on the system and you're back into playing your games in a more robust and comfortable format, which I will say, the system is pretty comfortable in the hands. It's a little bit heavier to use compared to other Switch models, but because it is a bigger system, this is something you just have to get used to. So at first, I wasn't as big of a fan of the ergonomics of the Switch 2 because of just how much bigger and heavier it was compared to, say, like the Switch OLED. It's not that much heavier of a system, but just that raw size difference alone. At first, it wasn't the most comfortable, as I found myself getting a little bit of like wrist pain holding the system for too long. But once I started getting used to the form factor, you know, you spread your arms out more and then you just grip the system more around the back here, resting like the back of your fingers on the Switch 2's back itself instead of just holding the Joy-Con with just your hands and then just resting your hands on the Joy-Cons. It's a pretty comfortable system to use for long periods, and you're not supposed to use something like a Switch 2 for like 2-3 hours at any given time without taking breaks. So it's still best to like play a couple rounds of games and then put it down for a few minutes, and then you can pick back up your Switch 2 and be good to go. It's a very comfortable system for its said form factor. And going back to those Joy-Con, I just really like the idea of just how easy it is to attach these systems and then just put the system into tabletop mode if you're playing in a handheld state. I just feel like it's a lot more robust to do that this time around with the magnet functionality of the Joy-Con. And since we're on the topic of these controllers, I think it's time we talked about the different ways of you playing your Switch 2 with all of the different controllers that it supports and its different ways of using those said controllers, because oh man, there's a lot to go over here. So let's start our controller talk by just talking about the Joy-Cons right away, as these are probably going to be your first experience with a Switch 2, whether it be in handheld or in the TV mode, as Joy-Cons come with your system. And I will say, these Joy-Cons are a much better experience to use in so many different ways compared to using the ones that came with the original Switch models, as these original Joy-Cons by comparison, they're not that much smaller on the camera, but they feel a lot smaller when you're holding them in your hands in general. The Switch 2 Joy-Cons just feel a lot more comfortable in the hands. The buttons are bigger. The overall size of the Joy-Cons are bigger. So using Joy-Con 2s here with the Switch 2 has just been a better experience. Whether it be using controllers on their own and just playing with them in separate hands for games, or using for the motion control stuff in certain titles. If you're dropping these down into the controller grip that comes with the Switch 2, or get like a charging grip, for example, using these in the grip feels a little more comfortable. Although I will say the grip takes some time to get used to with its form factor, but once you get used to the grip, it's a pretty comfortable way of playing games. Not my go-to controller I would grab, as I still would prefer a Pro controller of some kind on the Switch 2, but using the controller grip with the Joy-Cons feels pretty natural and a little bit of a better experience compared to the original Joy-Cons, just because of the size difference. But another thing about the Joy-Cons is now actually using these in its sideways mode actually feels pretty comfortable, because that's the problem I had with the original Switch Joy-Cons, as the buttons and also just the form factor was too small. So your hands felt very cramped at all times using the Joy-Con on its side, and it just didn't really make a lot of sense for so many games, especially with the super small triggers on the inside, forcing you to use the included wrist straps just to get extension buttons to hit these set triggers, and even then, still wasn't the most comfortable experience. But using the Joy-Con 2 sideways is much better. The buttons are a lot bigger, so it's just easier to hold, and especially with the S buttons on the inside, SL and SR, they're much bigger to a point now you don't have to worry about any riser buttons that hit these. They feel pretty comfortable to use. This is still not my go-to control scheme though, because I still think that using a Joy-Con sideways is a little uncomfortable for long periods, especially for pushing in your two thumbs so close together. It can result in some hand cramp issues, but this is still a much better experience compared to the original Joy-Con. But you can still use the original Joy-Con on your Switch 2. While you can't connect these physically to the console because, you know, you got magnet design to attach to the side of the system compared to a rail design for the Switch 1, you can connect these via Bluetooth, so you can just pair these Joy-Con to your Switch 2, and these will work on Switch 1 and Switch 2 games with no problems whatsoever. And in fact, in some cases, you might want to use the original Joy-Con over the Joy-Con 2 for very specific games, specifically the games that actually use that IR blaster on the right Joy-Con. Yeah, I know, like all 5 of them, if that, maybe even less or more, I don't know. Nintendo and third parties barely use this thing, but for the certain games that might require this specific piece of a Joy-Con, thankfully you can just hook up the Joy-Con 1s to a Switch 2 and just use all the features of these controllers perfectly fine, because they're fully backwards compatible, which is great. But there's one feature missing from these Joy-Cons that will make you reach for Joy-Con 2 for certain titles, and that is a brand new feature on the Switch 2 called Mouse Mode. So flipping down the joystick and holding it like a mouse, now you can use your Joy-Con in a completely new way. And this is a thing I have a love-hate relationship for, actually. Because the mouse mode stuff, it's really game dependent, in my experience, if it's a preferred control scheme or if it's just a gimmick. For games like Drag X Drive, I don't like mouse control at all, because on a game like that, you're moving your wrists around a lot more in more like spread out motions and very fast-paced ones, while also curling your hands down in such a way that you can get some pretty bad wrist pain after a while. And it's not the most ideal control scheme, so it will depend on the game for how well mouse mode works, because using this for like a first-person shooter, for example, the mouse controls feel fantastic, because aiming with the mouse mode on a Switch 2 feels the same in a lot of ways as just using a traditional computer mouse. It's fast, it's accurate, and it's very responsive to movement. And that's with or without using the included wrist straps for your Joy-Con 2. You're supposed to use the included wrist straps for these said controllers if you want to have a smoother experience gliding on pretty much any surface. As long as you have the Joy-Con 2 flat, it will work in mouse mode. So it can work on a table, work on your hands, on your lap, and it's a little more responsive when you use the included wrist straps since they have smoother feet on there for better gliding for the Joy-Con 2 itself to move around. But in my experience, using the Joy-Con 2 just on your own, like on your leg for example, maybe on a tabletop, without using those wrist straps, is still pretty good. But I would still recommend using those straps just for a better experience overall, so the controllers definitely move better with those straps attached. But the thing is, to me, I'm not the biggest fan of with mouse controls, actually the Joy-Con 2 itself. The same complaint I had while playing a game with the sideways Joy-Con control scheme, where your hands feel a little too pushed in and crunched, giving you a little bit of joint pain, also extends to using the mouse control because of how you're tilting your wrist. This is not in the same form factor as a traditional mouse. And you notice that for if a game supports proper mouse and keyboard control on the Switch 2. Using a mouse, for example, in a game like Mario Paint, and then going to a Joy-Con and using the mouse mode on the Joy-Con, you can feel a night and day difference because the ergonomics are just not here on this little controller. It's meant to be small and portable while also being versatile. And unfortunately, all those specific asks for this specific form factor, it can't do every job perfectly. It's going to have some shortcomings. And the biggest shortcoming I find is with comfort for the mouse mode. It's going to depend on the game, especially for mappings, as some games will map a lot of actions to the face buttons while still being used in mouse mode. So you're supposed to use your one finger to click in on the shoulder buttons, and then your thumb to click in buttons here, and then pull back on the joystick to move around on other actions. It can be a little cumbersome depending on how games function with the mouse mode. But for games that work well with the mouse mode support, they work really well. I just wish the ergonomics of the Switch Joy-Cons themselves were better for the mouse mode itself, because I can see myself using mouse mode in more titles, but maybe not for long periods of time like I would with a proper mouse on a computer. And that's all because of the ergonomics. Let's say you didn't want to play a game on your Switch 2 using Joy-Cons because maybe these controllers just don't really do it for you. The smaller ergonomics and just the fact that they're detached controllers like this, maybe you want a more traditional controller to use on your system. And that is where the Switch 2 Pro controller comes into play. And this here does feel like a pretty substantial upgrade compared to the original Switch System's Pro controller, as for the most part it is essentially the same controller at the heart of it all, with the same button layout and also the same exact kind of feature set for the most part. But there are some newer things added to the Switch 2 Pro controller that just make it a much better controller in my experience to use on the Switch 2. And the big one for me have gotta be these rear buttons on the back, these two GR and GL buttons. These are a game changer for a lot of different games. When playing using the Switch 2 Pro controller or the charging grip for your Joy-Con 2 controllers on a Switch 2, you can use these G buttons on the back of those said controllers to map out any of the different face buttons on your Switch 2, or even things like clicking in the sticks and such, or D-pad movements. You can map pretty much whatever you want to these G buttons, and it is so useful in so many different games. One game I can think of right away is Splatoon 3 for me, as to jump back to base, when you open the map, if you hit D-pad down, that will select your home base right away. And then you can press the A button to jump, but you have to take your hand off of the joystick for a moment to go down to the D-pad to do a super jump back to the base really fast. But I found that mapping one of these G buttons to D-pad down, then I can just open the map, hold down on my joystick still while clicking in my programmed G button, which acts as D-pad down, and then I can jump back to the base. I never once took my thumb off the left joystick. I do all that in one fell sweep. So that has been a really, really nice feature on the said controller. And just like with the Switch 2 controllers, you do have a dedicated C button on these controllers, which is that chat button, and this opens up game chat. But if you're not going to be using game chat, you can technically reprogram this button to anything else. You don't need to use it just for game chat, or you can just flat out turn it off. If you find yourself accidentally hitting the chat button, especially on the Switch 2 Pro controller, it's right next to the thumbstick, so if your hand slips, you can hit that button pretty easily. On the Joy-Con, it's right next to the home button, so it's super easy to hit on the Joy-Con too. So you can easily reprogram it or just turn it off entirely. So, it's nice to have a dedicated chat button on the controller just to go straight into game chat, but not really a feature I use too much on my Switch 2 to justify it. But again, the controller itself, to go back to the Switch 2 Pro controller, feels very robust. And one of my favorite things about the Pro controllers has always been just how they handled amiibo support, because on the Joy-Cons themselves, you had to tap an amiibo on the right analog stick, on the right Joy-Con, which wasn't the most comfortable experience and sometimes just flat out did not work all that well. And that's still the case with the Joy-Con 2 on the Switch 2. It's just a little finicky because you're placing down an amiibo on a round surface, which it's not great, but on the Pro controllers, you just tap on the logo on the controller, as that's where the NFC reader is. So you take your amiibo, tap it down on the Switch 2 logo on your Switch 2 controller, and it will read that said amiibo data pretty easily. I haven't really had any problems using amiibo on the Switch 2 Pro controller just because of that design difference. So it's just been a much better experience, at least for me, using the Switch 2 controller for amiibo stuff compared to using the Joy-Con 2. But you also have one other feature to mention with the Switch 2 Pro controller, is you have a dedicated headphone jack on the controller itself, and you don't get this when you're using the Switch 2 controllers with any charging grip from my experience. So it doesn't matter if you're using the included Joy-Con 2 grip or the standalone charging grip, they both don't have a headphone jack. So having the headphone jack on the Switch 2 Pro controller has been very nice, and it's a very similar feature that the PlayStation and the Xbox controllers have for their systems. You plug in some headphones to the Switch 2 controller, and now you're just listening to your game audio through the headphone port on your Switch 2, and it also works for gaming headsets, so you can just plug in a headset to the Switch 2 controller or the Switch 2 system itself to use a gaming headset microphone on your system. It's just super easy to do that, especially when you're just using it on the controller itself. It gets the job done pretty well, and it's just nice to just chill back, sit on a couch, plug in some headphones if you don't want to disturb someone around you, and it just works. It's super easy to use. You just hold the home button if you want to adjust the audio on the controller at any given time for your headphones. So it's very easy to adjust in a just simple submenu. And just in general, this controller, as mentioned earlier, just feels like a big improvement over the original Switch Pro controller. Even though they are the same design, buttons just feel a lot better on the Switch 2 Pro controller. The joysticks themselves feel better as well, just better like snapback and wider range. They just feel better to use in general. But if you don't have a Switch 2 Pro controller, or you don't have the money to buy one of these for your Switch 2, thankfully you can get a Switch Pro controller and use that on your Switch 2, as this controller will fully work on the system as well. You're not going to have those programmable G buttons, obviously, or the headphone jack, but everything else is here, so you can use the gyroscope, the amiibo functionality, all the buttons are the same, so it just works. But one thing to mention though, if you're going to use a Switch Pro controller or even the original Switch Joy-Cons with your Switch 2, is that you cannot wake the system from sleep when pressing the home button using Switch controllers. So on the Switch 2, whether it be with a Joy-Con 2 or the Switch 2 Pro controller, if you press the home button, the system will wake up from sleep mode, and then you can unlock the system by using the controller. Do this all from the comfort of your couch. This is something you're also able to do on the Switch 1, but you have to use the Switch 1 controllers on the Switch 1 itself. You can't use Switch 2 controllers on the Switch 1, fun fact. I don't know why, there's Bluetooth controllers, but something about how the Bluetooth changed between generations makes the Switch 2 controllers incompatible with the Switch 1. And as a side tangent, don't try to use the Switch 1 dock with Switch 2 or Switch 2 dock with Switch 1. They don't work. They don't have the same make and model fit. It just don't. Don't even try it. But to get back on topic here, on the Switch 1, you can wake up the system using the home button. If you try to use a Switch 1 controller on the Switch 2 to wake it up, you cannot do that. Pressing the home button on the Switch 2 controller is the only way you can wake the system. As using a Switch 1 controller, it's just going to be waiting for a signal and will never send a wake signal to the Switch 2, which I don't understand this. Like, why do I need the new one? Why do I need the new controller just to turn my system on? That makes no sense. It's just a Bluetooth functionality. It's a wake on Bluetooth signal. Both controllers have the same wake Bluetooth signal to it, but which is something with how the Switch 2 interacts with the Bluetooth hardware. It's different between the controllers, therefore it just doesn't work on Switch 1 controllers. You have to manually go over to your Switch 2 and hit the power button to wake it from sleep if you're going to want to use a Switch 1 controller on your Switch 2 system. It's a little inconvenient for no apparent reason, and I don't like that. I think that's kind of stupid, but you might, at that point, just leave your right Joy-Con detached from your Switch 2 at that point, and then use this controller to wake it from sleep, as you can just use your included Joy-Con 2 to wake it up. So I guess that's a solution if you just have a Switch 1 Pro controller, but don't want to physically get up to turn on your system. But then remember, you have this Joy-Con on, so go turn it off in the settings. Just kind of a mess for no reason. Why can't we just have wake on Bluetooth on Switch 1 controllers work on Switch 2? Maybe that could be a thing Nintendo patches in for the future, because as it stands now, I have no idea why we can't do that. In terms of some other features about the said Switch 2 system, one thing to note is how you can take screenshots and get some gameplay recordings off of the system itself, as this has been a feature that was there since the Switch 1 days, but things have changed since the Switch 1, and it's mainly just updating how resolution works at this point, because I'm going to be honest, the screenshot tool is perfectly fine. It works really well on the Switch and the Switch 2. All you have to do is press the capture button on your left Joy-Con or on your Switch Pro controller, and then that just takes a screenshot of your game. But if you want to record a gameplay clip, then you hold down the capture button and can record a 30-second clip from your system. This was not at launch for the Switch 1. This happened a few months into the system's life, but with the Switch 2, this is available right out of the gate. Unfortunately, they didn't really change anything when it comes to how long these captures are. And that's my biggest complaint with the capture functionality on the Switch 2. Because yes, you can still record gameplay clips on your Switch 2 by just holding down that capture button, but it's only up to 30 seconds. That is it. You can record up to 1080p clips now or get a 1080p screenshot, but this is only in Switch 2 specific games. If you're playing a Switch 1 game on the Switch 2 via its backwards compatibility, those said clips and screenshots are now only 720p. I don't know why they can't be 1080. That makes no sense. And also, why are we still restricting the clips to 30 seconds? That's nothing. You barely get enough time with how short these clips are. Like 30 seconds, really? Sometimes I have to take multiple clips of a moment because it's happening for longer than 30 seconds. Say if you have a moment where your character falls out of bounds, that could be maybe a minute, 2-minute clip, but the Switch 2 is only able to record that in 30-second moments. They save faster now at least, so there's a blessing, but I wish that you had more control over the recording functionalities on the Switch 2. If I was able to nerf the recording quality, so going down to 720p for Switch 2 games, but then being able to record now for a minute instead, I would prefer that, because 30-second clips are just not enough in so many cases. It just barely gets you by in a lot of those cool moments. And some games don't fully support clipping anyways, like say with Smash Ultimate when you're playing that game, which at that point then you're just hooking up your Switch 2 through an external capture card and recording more clips. And that's how I just kind of find myself recording bigger gameplay moments on the Switch 2 in general. Because the clip quality off of the Switch 2, it's okay. Again, the clips are not long enough, but 1080p clips for the Switch 2 games, they look pretty good. Good enough for social media clips. And then the 720p, it's alright. A little blurry and a little compressed, so I wish they had a little more bitrate to the clips. But again, it gets the job done. That's pretty much the takeaway for the game recording functionality on the Switch 2. It gets the job done. But I do wish that you can just control that a little bit more, like with the PlayStation and the Xbox family of systems, where you can record 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, or just adjust the time limit to however long you want, and then you can trim it down. If they just dedicated a little bit more to those settings for the player, then I would say that the game clipping functionality in the Switch 2 would be on par with the rest of the systems on the market right now. But as it stands, the clip functionality on the Switch 2 is probably the worst of the 3 main systems, and even compared to like PC gaming handhelds like a Steam Deck. Maybe one day Nintendo can give us more options for recording clips. Please, I'll like a minute clip, that'd be great. As it stands now, 30 seconds is just not enough in my opinion. But overall, I really enjoyed my time that I've spent so far with my Switch 2, and I find myself reaching for this system a lot more compared to my older Switch LCD model and my OLED especially in some cases, just because of how much better games run on the Switch 2. But there are still plenty of arguments to play games on the original Switch model, especially if you have a Switch OLED, for those games that aren't super demanding, because I still do prefer the screen of the Switch OLED. This still, to me, is a really solid system with a really good battery life, and I do wish we've had some kind of like an OLED variant of the Switch 2. Maybe that could be a refresh down the road with a better battery and the upgraded screen, but as it stands now, the Switch 2 is still a solid system to use, whether it be in the TV mode with its dock or in handheld mode, and I've liked a lot of the new additions to the system, like with the upgraded controller schemes and the better improvement on the hardware of the Switch 2. It's just essentially a Switch 1, but beefier. And that's pretty much all anyone has asked for, is just give us something better than this Android tablet from 2017. So now we got an Android tablet made in 2025, and it's so much more robust. But it just, at least in the beginning, when it was first coming out in 2025, the launch library wasn't fully there to sell for a lot of people. In terms of first-party exclusive games, when you're not counting the third-party releases on the Switch 2, or Switch 1 games getting upgrades for the Switch 2 specifically, there's not that many games that launched with the Switch 2. And in fact, there were only 2 games specifically that came out on launch day made by Nintendo that were fully exclusive for the said hardware, which was Mario Kart World and Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour. And that latter one, I don't even know if I call that a game. So I'm just going to talk into the robot here, so let's just talk into the robot until it talks back at me. Audio jungle, here we come. Let's go. Please start talking. Oh my god, how do I talk? I can't keep on talking like this. Please go. Oh my god. Oh, here it goes. Ah! Help! Help! Oh my god. There's so much going on. A month later, after the system came out, then we had more offerings, but again, for first-party exclusive titles, we only had Donkey Kong Bonanza. And it took until November for us to get more first-party exclusives for the Switch 2, with games like Age of Imprisonment and Kirby Air Riders. But Kirby Air Riders and Mario Kart World have a very similar niche, both kart racing games, so variety is not really fully here, at least at the time of reviewing the Switch 2 now, here at the end of 2025, going into 2026. I've had some people ask me, is it worth buying a Switch 2 system? I'm not really interested in the current catalog games like with Donkey Kong or Mario Kart, so is it worth just getting that for like the upgrades to Switch 1 library or some of these future titles? And I've had a hard time answering that question because it really is going to depend on the kind of player you are, and if you're going to want those backwards compatible titles on the Switch 2 at that point. You want those upgrades, you want games to run better, and you're just wanting to have the system now for those games that are going to release on Switch 2, as Nintendo has already announced that going forward, they're wanting to now focus all the development stuff to the Switch 2 family and not the Switch 1. So at this point, we can see Switch 1 developments ramp down and first-party games coming to the Switch 2 exclusively going forward. But that's going to take some time. So, my recommendation is that if you're not fully interested in the current catalog of games on the system at the current moment, then wait. As while the Switch 2 is a fun system and has a lot of improvements over the original hardware, you can still get by with the original Switch hardware, whether it be the OLED model or even just a flat-out OG Switch. Like, this is my launch model that I had ever since 2017, and this is still going strong. I still pick up the system every once in a while, whether it be in handheld mode or to dock on a TV to play certain lighter-based games, like with an indie title, for example. This is still a good system to use for a lot of different games, especially with the earlier Switch catalog. But that's where the argument, I think, is a more personal argument, because I do say, like, give it like another year or two, this Switch 2 is definitely going to be worth it. We're going to have a lot more first-party games hit the system that are going to be system sellers. But this first few months of the Switch 2, I feel its launch library has been weaker compared to the Switch 1, but this system launched with Breath of the Wild, this one launched with Mario Kart World. Big difference in catalogs. Breath of the Wild being a highly anticipated game for many, many years, and a very different style of game from Nintendo that hooked audiences from minute one. It was a big open world game that you can spend hundreds of hours in just screwing around and trying to 100% things. It's a very different beast compared to what the Switch 2 launched with Mario Kart World, as if you're not fully in the kart racing games, it was a little bit of a harder sell. And Mario Kart World did kind of launch in a more controversial state to some players, as some players didn't like some of the changes made compared to the previous entry. So again, I feel the starting out library for the Switch 2 just wasn't as strong as the Switch 1, as the first year of the Switch 1 had hit after hit, but it's not fully there yet with the Switch 2. It's a fantastic system to go back and play those Switch 1 games with, as now pretty much every Switch 1 game that I can really think of just runs better on the Switch 2, and is a much better experience. But you're not really missing out if you don't have the hardware just yet, and that's very important to know. But again, give some time, and I can highly recommend the Switch 2, as this is one of the best valued handheld systems out there right now. You look at the PC gaming handheld scene, and outside of the Steam Deck, a lot of other company offerings are very expensive while not really being fully worth it, and the Switch 2, at the value it's currently set at, is a very powerful system and very affordable for its price, for its said power. So it's very easy to recommend the Switch 2 for that very diehard Nintendo fan that wants the latest and greatest from Nintendo and experience Nintendo titles, while also having a good portable system for even some third-party outings as well. But at the same time, you can wait on the Switch 2 a bit until there's more available for the system if you have your doubts. Give it a year or two, this will definitely be a highly recommended product. As right now, it just depends on what kind of games you want to play. But I'm very happy with my Switch 2 system, and I'm definitely excited to play more games on it, like with Metroid Prime 4, Splatoon, Raiders, and such. This is definitely going to be a system I get a lot of mileage of for these next few years in this specific generation of Nintendo, and I'm excited to see where the Switch 2 goes from here. But with that said, that's going to do it for this said video. Thank you guys for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.